You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.
Let's move now to our Washington Outlook panel. A new administration and change of power in the Senate will no doubt bring changes to the options industry. This next session brings together Washington experts to discuss the impacts of this new administration. Our moderator is no stranger to navigating these changes. It's my pleasure to welcome the Honorable Jill Summers, Senior Advisor for Potomac Global Partners and former two-term commissioner at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Commissioner Summers?
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for the 2021 Washington Outlook panel. I'm so happy to have our distinguished panelists with us today. Ryan Yocum, who's Vice President at Goldman Sachs. Walton Lyles, who's a principal at the Blue Ridge Law and Policy PC. And Jeff Strunk, Managing Partner at Forbes Tate. Good morning to everyone. I think we're just going to jump right in. President Biden's first 100 days, he will address the nation and the Congress this evening. Obviously, he has had initial challenges with the pandemic, vaccinations, and other issues that have pushed their way to the front over the past few months. Economic instability, immigration surge at the southern border, racial tensions, and global environmental issues. I'm going to start with Jeff and ask you, as the president addresses the nation tonight, how do you think he will frame his first 100 days in office? And what do you think the issues will be that he will outline in his speech?
Thanks, Joe. I think the president will initially start off about his response to the pandemic and the passage of the American Rescue Plan, outlining his response to the pandemic and the number of people who are vaccinated. I think we'll first kind of take a little bit of a victory lap on that, saying that we're not out of the woods yet, but we're getting closer and we're a better place than when he started 100 days ago. They've largely focused on that message thus far. I do expect him to quickly turn to the next phase of his response, which is going to be the American Jobs Plan, which is largely focused on infrastructure, and then the American Family Plan, which is largely focused on students and education and child tax credits and things of that nature. I do think you also have the expectation that he will talk a lot about climate and what our response is. I don't expect him to focus too much on immigration because I think it's a box that they're trying to get out of and how to fix the crisis at the border. But I largely think he'll try to take a positive message, which he has thus far, and also play up to part of his base on some of the progressive ideas that they're pushing for.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'm going to bring in Ryan and Walton and ask you how you think that some of those issues will end up playing out on the Hill. Ryan, we'll start with you.
Sure. So, I think the president has put forth two proposals, one related to infrastructure and some of the clean energy with some of his corporate tax proposals. And then, we've now seen some of the details for the second part of one of his big agenda items, which is more of the human infrastructure side, as Jeff alluded to, paired with some of the individual tax increases. And so now I think, it's going to be for congressional leaders to decide how that will potentially move through the legislative process. I think early on, there's still some discussion of potential bipartisanship and whether or not they can potentially court some Republicans in the middle on some of these proposals. I think that's yet to be seen. I think, another big decision that they will need to make is, how they sort of package it all together, move it as one item or potentially two. And then also, I think, one of the other sort of big questions that's outstanding is, will they feel the need to offset all of the spending across both of those proposals for infrastructure, energy, and now some of this, the sort of human infrastructure piece of this. So I think a lot of the big decisions about how this will be translated into legislation and then moved, through the House and Senate have yet to be made. But I think we're going to see that play out over the next several months.
Well, how about from you? How do you think the Senate and the House will address these issues?
No, I think Ryan laid it out very well. I think one of the things we saw with the last package was the White House tried to sort of redefine what bipartisanship was by sort of bipartisan support for the package, even, sort of from the political, from people at large versus from politicians. And I think you're going to see a bit of that again, where there are definitely pieces of these packages that have sort of broad support. And I think the key, as Ryan articulated, is how you put them all together and what mechanism you use to move them. These are, I think the total spend, if you look at the COVID relief package plus these sort of what's been laid out, I think is somewhere around $6 trillion. So, it's a ton of spending. I don't think that there's an expectation that all of that can get done and get across the finish line, certainly not in a bipartisan way. So I think it's just going to be an issue of trade-offs. I think we're going to see over the summer, especially on the infrastructure side, sort of laying the case for why infrastructure is a bipartisan issue. And I think there is bipartisan support for infrastructure. But at the end of the day, how you sort of put those items together and what that final package it's awfully hard to see some of the elements that have been laid out in both the corporate tax side and the individual tax side being in a position where they would ultimately get bipartisan support from legislators.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, President Biden campaigned as somebody who could unite Republicans and Democrats. And so there was sort of a expectation that as he pushed forward, this heavy agenda, that he would be doing things or he would be working with the leadership in the House and the Senate to get bipartisan support. Do you see any particular roadblocks with these issues and how do you think he may be able to gain more bipartisan support on some of these big ticket infrastructure, tax, and how does that play out? Any of you, if you have ideas.
Julie, I think that, Joe, that a lot of this, I think bipartisan means decorum. I don't think there's a lot of bipartisan proposals that are in here, especially on the tax side, the corporate rate, capital gains, individual rate. All those things are non-starters with Republicans. What he has successfully done is lower the volume from a decorum standpoint. So I think that's kind of what he means. So I think that to Ryan Walton's point, forget bipartisan support. There is a path, and it has to be significantly pared back. And given the margins in the House and the Senate, it's hard to see this all coming together. It's pared back very significantly. And I think that everyone hears about Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema because they're the kind of swing voters that are controlling the ebb and flow in the Senate. But on some of these tax proposals, but what he'll frame tonight too, there's actually a lot less Democrat support than people believe. I think it's only down to 2 senators. So I think that they have to really manage expectations tonight and how this plays out. And, Congress works on deadlines. We have 2 deadlines coming up, right? We have the debt ceiling has to be raised. We have to fund the government September 30th. So I think that we're probably looking in that timeline for something to come together. But I think bipartisanship is going to be very difficult to see.
That's a really good point. And so then maybe talk about when you look at the timeline, how do you think that time is done before midterm elections? Because that always really, plays into what an administration is targeting on their own internal timelines. Any of you that may have ideas on what needs to get done in the short time frame?
Well, so I think I can take that one. I mean, I think Walton used the term trade-offs, and I think that's going to be sort of an inherent theme here in the way that they think about moving this forward. And I think you have, the Democratic Party that wants to be very bold, and they feel like they have an opportunity and they want to pursue, significant changes while they have control. And they also know that they have razor thin margins, in both the House and the Senate. And so I think, there's sort of a push and pull here, which is, there's going to be some, I'm sure, within the party that want to move very quickly to try to get something done. And then there's the reality of trying to keep the caucus together and pull a package together that keeps, particularly in the Senate, all 50 Democratic senators together. So I think that is probably a process that takes some time and sort of carries into the fall and later this year, would be my guess.
Right. Those are really good points. Yeah. So let's turn more specifically to issues that this industry, particularly cares about. And how do you think the agenda of House Financial Services or Senate Banking, may tackle some of the issues that are at the forefront?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start there. I think for Senate banking, I think, one of the big things that you've seen sort of as far as priority and focus is, when Chairman Brown talks about it, he says the Senate Banking and Housing Committee, and, very much has trying to make that point that this is sort of broader than just the traditional financial regulatory space. And if you look at the hearings they've had to date, focus on workers and inequality and diversity and climate. So it's much less on it to date. It's been much less on the sort of technical financial regulatory landscape, and much more sort of on the broader sort of themes. And, somewhat the same in House Financial Services, I think, where you've seen, again, climate, diversity. Obviously, there have been the hearings related to sort of specific market activity, but by and large, I feel like both committees have turned into sort of more thematic than sort of, and I think, and that's a reality of there's not actually a lot of legislation that's going to be moving in the financial regulatory space. That's going to be left to the regulators and will take time as they get into place. So I feel like we've seen the committees focus much more on sort of big picture themes that will drive action at the regulators than on sort of specific legislative proposals that may sort of try to move or have legs.
Brian, do you have any comments about the agenda? Sorry, Jeff.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm just going to say, too, that Senate banking is tied up in infrastructure as well. So that's also going to be a bogged down part of their agenda. And, Gensler just got confirmed. So I think there's also the chairwoman and Sherrod Brown are looking for some direction from him as well. So I think that's part of the combination as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of that. And I think Walton, made the point that, some of the issues that we're seeing more in focus now are, a little bit more outside the scope of direct financial regulation and more of, how the financial system can deliver on things like diversity and inclusion and racial justice and income, equality. And so I think that's really what we're seeing, a lot of from both of the committees in terms of their focus.
I think that's a good segue into my next question about the financial regulatory agencies and how you may see, them assisting in President Biden's agenda, and what can the agencies like the FSOC members do to further the agenda that President Biden is laying out? Ryan.
Sure. So, I think that, one of the things that we're hearing a lot of from Treasury and from the White House is that, as it relates to climate change, it's a whole of government approach. And we're certainly seeing that with regard to the federal financial regulators. So, particularly with Secretary Yellen at leading the Financial Stability Oversight Council, she's been very direct and forward that is a critical piece of the agenda for Treasury, both here in the U.S., but also internationally. So I think we're going to see her play that coordinating role amongst the financial regulators. So even, where you might not necessarily think that there would be an agenda, even from agencies like CFTC, they may be looking at these issues as well as part of the sort of whole of government approach. I think a couple other things that, for the financial services industry that will be interesting over time, and Secretary Yellen has sort of indicated this, but they are conducting some reviews about some of the events of the past year where there has been market turmoil, and they want to sort of assess certain vulnerabilities. So I think one of the things that Secretary Yellen has spoken about relates to non-bank financial intermediation and even Treasury markets, where we saw some of the disruption in Treasury markets in March. So I think there's going to be, a lot of discussion amongst the agencies with regard to those issues. The other thing that I would just note, and it sort of gets back to, talking about the congressional agenda, is that, Treasury is going to continue to play a very important role in shaping this legislative package with infrastructure and tax, particularly because on the tax piece, a major component of that is international tax. And that's where Treasury is directly involved in negotiations with other countries around trying to come to some sort of global, minimum tax rate. And so Treasury will be very instrumental, I think, in the discussions taking place on the Hill, and also sort of serving as, an assessment of where the economy stands in relation to some of these changes.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And so on really the topic of financial regulators, let's turn to the SEC. We have a new SEC chairman sworn in. He's been on the job, I guess, a little over a week. Walton, can you talk about, what you think that Chairman Gensler will address, first on his agenda, and maybe a little bit about how you see the differences between his chairmanship of the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting if you go back sort of over the last few chairs, you've had sort of different, they've come in at different points in different environment, where you had, Mary Shapiro was there during the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank, and sort of her agenda was sort of very much dictated for her. Mary Jo White comes in, it's a big enforcement focus. And then you have, Clayton sort of had a clean slate to have his agenda. I think Gensler's got a little bit of sort of in between, if you look at it when compared to those people, where there have been certainly some market driven events that Ryan mentioned that I think is going to have to drive some of the agenda, whether it's sort of GameStop or the March volatility from last year, Archegos. And then I think there's also some big political priorities that were also mentioned in climate and diversity and inclusion that are going to sort of prioritize. And so when you look at that, it really leaves less space for sort of what I don't think Gensler is coming in the same way that Jay Clayton, where it's like you sort of get to prioritize what you want to do. A lot of these priorities are really sort of been dictated. I think the one area, sitting back from afar that I think there's an expectation that he will address, and that maybe is a priority that sort of he doesn't have to act here, but I think people would like him to, is in the digital sort of asset space and cryptocurrency, sort of laying some, that's an area where he's had a lot of experience and interest teaching. And so I think that's sort of maybe if you look at it sort of like the area where he may choose to focus, but a lot of these other priorities are sort of just dictated to him both by the sort of bigger picture politics and sort of the recent market events.
Yeah. And so, Ryan, talk about a little bit about what you think about the SEC's agenda and, how you think Chairman Gensler will, as we all know, he needs to get to 3 votes on any of these big ticket items, and how he may approach some of these issues to get to 3.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, he's very competent. He's a very competent regulator. And so I think we should anticipate that the SEC is going to have a very active agenda. And there's going to be a lot on the agenda, that will cover wide-ranging issues. So I think that is certainly something that we would anticipate. I agreed with Walton in terms of, some of the issues that are likely to come up. And I do think that, the market structure piece will be interesting. In so much as, in his confirmation process, just because of some of the market events of the last few months, Chairman Gensler did indicate that he will undertake a holistic review of market structure for equity market structure. And what will be interesting to see is, where Chairman Clayton really focused a lot of his efforts there on market data, and that process is still sort of being implemented. There was a lot of bipartisan support behind that component. It'll be interesting to see how he can move that forward, and if he can continue sort of a spirit of bipartisanship as he's looking at equity market structure that was sort of there as they looked at market data in the last couple of years. So I think it's going to be a very active and interesting agency over the next couple of years.
Yeah, no doubt. And so how do you think, maybe there's an interplay between all of these issues? And you have mentioned a few of them, whether it's market structure issues or whether it's ESG disclosure or some of these, items that we know that members of Congress care about. How do you think that Chairman Gensler sort of positions himself on these issues to, be in a place, at least when I worked with him at the CFTC, he was always very cognizant of trying to get more than 3 votes on an issue. How do you think he positions himself with the other 2 Republicans at the SEC to see if he can get some, coordination or support on some of these bigger issues at the SEC? Walton, do you have a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are much more difficult than others, right? On some of the climate, ESG, corporate governance agenda, they're just very divergent views from the Republican commissioners and the Democrat commissioners on those issues. It's just hard for me to see a real path. I think on some of the maybe the more market-based issues, you could certainly in the cryptocurrency space, you could see there being more agreement with the Republican commissioners and Gensler. So I think it's just going to depend on the issue. I mean, I think certainly, in response to GameStop, there's been a lot of talk on the Hill and elsewhere on shortening the settlement cycle. That certainly seems like an issue where he could start off getting sort of broad bipartisan support from the commissioners on advancing that agenda. Additional disclosure regarding payment for order flow would probably garner bipartisan support. I think, trying to ban or more limitations, I think it gets harder. So I think I suspect that there will be a way for him to advance some items with bipartisan support, and then some others I think are just probably too hot button politically, and the commissioner's views are just too divergent where you could really see a path forward.
Does anybody else have any views on maybe his path forward on some of these issues? If not, I'm going to move past policy and move back to politics, because you can't have a Washington Outlook panel without addressing, the politics of all of it. So you have a 50-50 Senate. You have a very tight vote House, 218, I think, to 212. And Jeff, as you know, on any given day in the House, there's 4 or 5 members who don't show up. So, how do some of these issues, especially big ticket issues, how does politics play into what we're going to see over the next few months in Washington?
It's pretty much everything at this point. I think that the margins are just so tight, and just yesterday the census came back and outlined how that's going to change the congressional map as far as seats. So you have a lot of members that are thinking about reelection, members are thinking about retiring, because based on the map, Republicans are expected to likely win back the House based on Virginia alone. So I think that it puts Speaker Pelosi in a very difficult spot trying to navigate our conference, because there are a number of moderate members that Democratic Party that are sitting in districts that President Trump won. So I think there's also this push and pull that you can see. If Pelosi's a very, very effective speaker, and she's typically gets everyone in line, but it's the tightest of margins we've never had before, this tight, and also with the 50 Senate. So I think that Ryan pointed this out earlier about what they cobble together. It's tough to see, because you also have the pull from the more progressive side of the wing of the party with moderates, and if you pull the lever one way, then you lose people on this side, and you do the other way with that side. So this is why everything that Biden's outlined it's very, very difficult to see a path forward on some of it. But as I said, Pelosi's very effective. So see.
Brian or Walton, do you have any comments on the political side of all of this?
I would just, I think Jeff's right. And I think what he laid out is it's why it's so difficult, which is, if history's any guide and redistricting, and Republicans would sort of in a midterm be favored to take the House back, that also puts increased pressure to act and go big on sort of a progressive agenda in the short run, but that almost ensures that you end up losing control, right? So that makes it more difficult to retain control. So it's just the yin and the yang there is just really, it's a really tough decision, and puts the speaker in a very difficult place, because the tight margins actually and the potential to lose control in 2 years puts more and more pressure to go big now and get something done, but it also makes it that much more politically difficult to do so.
Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think whereas with the American Rescue Plan, we saw that what President Biden put out was largely what Congress then took up and passed. And I think it's just going to be a completely different scenario with the American Jobs Plan and the infrastructure plan for those reasons that Jeff and Walton just outlined. I think you're going to have, members that will feel, this is the opportunity. This is the legislative vehicle that's moving this year. So any of the priorities they want to get in, it's sort of essential that it happen on that legislative package, which just makes negotiations that much more complicated. I do think that a lot of the focus is on the programmatic side for a lot of Democrats. It's about these new programs to put in place, but the revenue raising side of it is going to be very complicated from a political perspective, particularly as we're going through an economic recovery. And some of the tax concepts are very complicated and complex. So, putting all of those pieces together and getting support, across the spectrum of the Democratic caucus in particular is going to be really challenging.
I agree with all of you. So real quick, we have like 30 seconds left for all three of you. Lightning round. How long do you think the speech is going to be tonight? I'll start with you, Jeff. Anybody else?
What did Jeff say?
Predictions? I didn't hear his answer.
Oh.
For some reason, he's...
Oh, I said 1 hour. Sorry, I thought it was on mute. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I would probably say it. I was going to go with maybe, an hour or so, 45 minutes.
Walton?
Yeah, under an hour, and I can tell you I will be watching for far under an hour.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Great Washington Outlook panel. Great 2021 Options Industry Conference. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Summers, for your panel. We invite you now to click into the Retail Rises session on the agenda page. This next session will begin shortly.
You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions@theoptionsinsider.com.